So an incredibly experienced panel. We are very privileged to have them all here discussing this topic together. I'm sure it will be an incredibly rich discussion. So I will pass it over to you, Alex, without further ado.
Yeah, thanks, Kile Kurakoto. We are a man down at the moment. Rod is up in the UK and it's the middle of the night. So he may be sleeping in, but we'll try and call him and see if we can rustle him up for the conversation. Otherwise, well, the worst that can happen is we actually have time for Q&A at the end rather than just offer it and then run out of time. So look, delighted to be here. And when we were thinking about an event that we could run for B Corp Month, our sort of sense was there's a lot of talk of new economies and the regenerative economy. B Lab's vision is for an inclusive, equitable, regenerative economy. But what does that actually mean? You know, what does it look and feel like to be in a regenerative economy? You know, how will it work? What will businesses be doing there? So we thought it would be a sort of interesting and generative conversation to think into that future. And we're going to use the Three Horizons framework as a bit of a conversation device. So many of you may have come across the Three Horizons. It's a way of thinking in an engaged way about the future, especially in uncertainty. And it enables us to take stock of the present, Horizon 1, but then think into the far future around what are the preferred and possible futures we actually want to bring forth. And then as a result, we can then think about the areas for disruption, the transition pathways, which can take us from here to there. So we're going to have 3 rounds of conversation with the panel, focusing on current state, the preferred and possible future, and then some of these sort of areas which will be necessary for transition. So before I start the conversation, I also just want to take one moment to talk about the idea of regeneration or regenerative economies. You know, it's important to have new language to describe things which are different from now, but we often also get lost in rhetoric and jargon as well. So at least for me, and I know that the panelists will probably give their own perspective, regenerative is important because it's going beyond doing no harm or less harm. It's around positive, net positive impact. And importantly, it's also about building the capacity within systems, be them communities, economies, ecosystems, for those systems to evolve and maintain their own health. So there is a regenerative quality to regenerative, which is evolved from the way that we have you know, traditionally thought and spoken about sustainability. Okay, so we're gonna get into it and take some stock of where we are now. And Joe, I'm going to come to you first. You know, what's your sense of, you know, what's working now? Let's start with, you know, sort of, you know, strengths of where we are. What's working now and, you know, things that we need to strengthen going into the futures that we want to see?
Sure, kia ora koutou. I think from my perspective, what is working increasingly well is the sense that we are all interdependent. So that using the sort of B Corp parlance, I think there's a much greater need on an individual level that we're all interdependent and that we need to build resilience into our systems. And also at a national level for, you know, for New Zealand, that also means acknowledging that you're part of a global value chain and we have, you know, international trade relationships and things that we depend on, which to some degree transcend the kind of idiosyncrasies of our own discourse about things like climate change. So there's very much an awareness of this. We need each other. We need to figure out ways to work together, you know, funding and financing the net zero transition, for an example, is one area where private capital is going to have to play a role alongside public funding. But I think what needs to be strengthened in order to realize, you know, sort of the promise of truly being interdependent is the way that we work together. So we're quite locked into behavioural orthodoxies that prevent us from trusting each other. that encourage us to work in silos. And in my role with the centre, I spend a lot of time talking about this in the context of public, private and iwi Māori collaboration. But if you're going to be really fair, we also see this all the time with peak bodies and community organisations and non-profits who compete as well. It's not just that relationship between government and the private sector. So I think we just need all to become more comfortable with the fact that we need each other. And then I also think it's really, really great that it is now very acceptable to talk about your business as having a purpose. That's something other than profit. So that was not the case, 10 years ago. But my personal view is that we need to stop pretending that there's more purpose than there actually is. And I think most businesses still largely exist to drive shareholder profit. I think we should be honest about that. And I think we should focus more on what are the products and services and business models that are really regenerative or even sustainable than incremental adjustments to things that are kind of inherently unsustainable. Yeah.
So just, I mean, you're in a position where you've got sort of, a really sort of quite unique view on how finance is evolving. Is there a sense of, kind of what's not working within the financial sector or with investment flows, sort of in the economy at the moment? Could you give us a sense of sort of something specifically in that area which aren't working at the moment?
So for the centre, I mean, we work on the basis of a roadmap, which is sort of a provocation that says the financial system's not fit for driving positive social and environmental outcomes over, financial outcomes over the long term versus short term. So that's sort of our starting position. The financial system is not currently fit for purpose. I think, though, you have to be quite careful about thinking about this over different timescales. So we have an enormous job to do right now, mobilising a ton of money into a low emissions economy really quickly. Very aggressive timeline. So we can't navel gaze too much about fixing the whole financial system. Kind of have to use it in its current state to do what it does, which is enable change in the real economy. And we have to orient it towards the right kinds of change. So for me, over the long term, do we need to kind of fix the fundamentals of the system, like what it is fundamentally designed to do? Probably, but over the short term, I think we're smart if we recognise it as a crucial enabler and kind of utilise the power that it has in its current state.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And it seems my experience of speaking with anyone who's sort of looking at change through a systems lens, that ability to work on multiple horizons at the same time seems to be an essential kind of, capability. And, in one way or another, the whole kind of thing of like, we're working in the system or trying to change the system, and we have to do those things in parallel rather than expect, everything to stop and, to have some kind of utopian future suddenly unfold. So I really appreciate those comments. Jennifer, coming to you. So I wanted to get a sense of, sitting where we are now, what are the trends that you see are emerging, which are going to be really sort of consequential in sort of transitions to future economies? And so let's start there first of all.
Sorry. Well, I think asking that question to most people, that they would kind of focus on tech as being one of the sort of more influential trends. But I think we should put tech into perspective, because tech is really neutral. So we're talking about AI, machine learning, blockchain, that sort of new tech. And it's generally adopted by firms to enhance their productivity and to give them a competitive edge. And so tech is a means to succeed in whatever system that we have. So tech's neutral and it won't drive deep systemic change because it's very transferable across systems. So the only thing that will really create radical change in the system that we have is if we change the values that underpin the system. And so over the last 50 years, I guess the most dominant values that we've had in our society have been individualism, which is the freedom kind of to make choices without interference from other people. And also a dominant value has been accumulation. So that's the the sense of security that we get from accumulating property, from savings, and from just accumulating stuff as well. And so these values drive growth, and capitalism depends on them. So capitalism locks in those two values, and it uses things like advertising to lock in individualism and interest to lock in accumulation. So the only way we're going to break that particular system and have something that's new is if we have a change in the underlying values. And values change only very slowly, very rarely. So, but because of the situation that we're in now, with the pandemic, with the cyclones, with the geopolitical strife around the world, we're finding that humanity has had a bit of a shock, especially in the global north. We've had a shock that we've not been used to this level of shock before. So it's jolted us into reassessing our values. And so what we're seeing emerging is two key changes. And one thing is a new ethics, which is around the self-limiting of our use of energy and resources. And what that's doing is it's elevating the values of sufficiency and sharing. And the other thing that we're probably beginning to notice right now is that we're facing some really frightening uncertainties. So we're actually beginning to turn more to one another. And we're prioritizing mutually supportive communities, communities that are self-determining, which is a little bit different to individual self-determination. So it's more of a reliance at community level, that you're doing things that work for everyone around you. And also active stewardship of our local biospheres is actually becoming a little bit more important to people now as well. So I would say these are wartime values in a way. They're indigenous values, they're rural values. So they're not values that we're not aware of, but we're actually gathering them together and elevating them in a new way. And I think that we're going to find our new economy is going to form around these new emerging values.
Thanks, Jennifer. And where you started, I was reminded, and I forget who said it, but the quote that technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. But I think the point's the same, right? That technology in itself is a tool, and it's how we kind of shape and apply those tools, which will facilitate the nature of the transitions. So thanks both there for some insights on sort of where we are in the current state. I now want to sort of jump to, kind of the third horizon. So sort of a place where we can start to actually envision what we might want. And that sort of sense of imagination and visioning is critical, because unless we have sort of pictures of where we want to get to, we don't have that kind of sort of orientation and navigation. So while it may seem far away, it's important that we actually start to sort of describe and articulate the preferred and possible futures that we want to shift to. So with that in mind, Jennifer, I'm going to come back to you. For you, what does a regenerative economy look like?
Well, if I could just go back to what you said before and just say how much I agree with you that we need that shared vision, because a lot of people are trapped in anxiety, I think, about what the future holds for them. And that can actually inhibit our ability to act, and it can actually polarize people a lot as well. That sort of fear mongering that is actually within our media at the moment. So having some shared positive vision of the future, particularly at a national level, gives us all something like a shared focal point that enables us to actually backcast and make coherent decisions today that actually help us avoid short-termism. And short-termism actually sort of destroys value that actually belongs to the next generation. So we want to avoid that. So having this narrative about the future, it's a really powerful thing. But it's also, because it's the future and we're not predicting anything, we're just projecting ideas, it's also quite abstract. So, depending on how far in the future you look. So if I was to imagine, New Zealand 25 years from now, around about the year 2050, I would say that I would hope that we would have built a lot more resilience into our society. And the way that I think that might happen is that we would have figured out that businesses and social enterprises and government departments They're not standalone entities. They're not competitive things. They're actually processes. These things are processes, and we will have figured out that these processes are parts of provisioning systems, and those provisioning systems have the mission of meeting people's needs and meeting everybody's needs everywhere, and doing so within planetary boundaries. And so it's going to be a very fair, a very efficient economy, and its success will depend upon those provisioning systems and those processing enterprises being regenerative and also being distributive, because you can't have one without the other. If you just have regeneration, you might end up with sort of elitism. So you have to redistribute the benefits of that regenerative economy. And so being regenerative, I think, in New Zealand means that people will see themselves and nature as co-elements of a socio-ecological system. And so we only enhance that system by cooperating with nature. And so we kind of have to, in our global north sense of ourselves in New Zealand, we have to kind of let go of some of those global north feelings and values and beliefs, and pick up more of the indigenous values that we know exist in our society and elevate them a bit more. To be distributive, what we're talking about there is about sharing benefits more fairly. So we see that a lot in sort of not-for-profit and, you know, cooperative kind of organizations. But really what we're talking about is sharing goods and services so that everybody gets what they need, but also sharing the value that is created in organizations so that it doesn't all go to shareholders. A lot more of it goes to workers. And so those people who are creating the value get the benefits of the value as well. So the key differences from today are that entities will see themselves as processes, not as standalone organizations, and they'll be more focused on producing use value rather than exchange value. So it'll be a much less competitive world in about 25 years' time, if this narrative is what actually happens, but who knows?
No, that's great. And where my head goes to is also what value we account for, and recognizing that there are, you know, what we account for in our current economic systems is quite narrow. And there's a whole heap of things that we intrinsically know are important and valuable, but which go unrewarded and unaccounted for. So it would seem that somewhere in a regenerative economy that we actually are far more sophisticated in understanding the, you know, the various contributions which are being made to each other, the environment, you know, and so on and so forth. So Jennifer, I really appreciate that sort of those deep insights. So Joe, coming over to you and asking the same question, you know, for you, you know, what would a regenerative economy, you know, sort of look like?
Sure. So I guess I'm spending a lot of time thinking about finance, so I'll just stick with the finance track. I personally, you know, I've had the opportunity in years gone by to spend time with Professor Muhammad Yunus, who started the Grameen Bank, and I really love the model that he demonstrated with that bank, which essentially uses community connection and peer pressure as the collateral for loans rather than property or physical assets. So Yunus he's a pretty extraordinary person, but his provocation is that traditional banks are created to serve the rich, not the poor, and that if you want to create an inclusive bank, then you need to make it from a different starting point and in a different model. And so he is also quite famous for saying that human beings aren't really designed to work for somebody else, and that we're problem solvers, and that's why we've survived. And I think there's quite a lot of truth to this, but I think the way the current financial system is organized, it's quite hard to be entrepreneurial, and it's quite hard to be a problem solver because you need those physical assets. Sometimes even just to get started, and this obviously is really difficult for people who don't have, you know, don't come into the system with those assets. So entrepreneurship, I think, will be kind of a crucial part of whatever is our future economy, and the ability to realize things in your community or for yourself. I think the way that we design kind of with communities at the center, or with purpose at the center of the way that we're designing, is probably also going to become much more natural in a different type of economy. And so, just by way of example, I was talking to someone the other day who's a community housing provider, and we were talking about inclusive insurance off the back of climate related events. And he said, if we design solutions for our vulnerable communities, our most vulnerable communities, then they end up benefiting everyone. So I think that there's quite a lot of wisdom in that statement. The way that we design and the starting point for the design of our products and services will probably look quite different in an ideal, quite aspirational, but in an ideal, future economy.
So two things come up for me there, Jo. One around sort of almost the blend of the solidarity of the Grameen model, but also recognizing that it's around unlocking entrepreneurship. Matthew Taylor, who is the chief executive of the Royal Society of the Arts in the UK, he for many years, he spoke around the importance of really understanding core human motivations around we respond to authority, we crave solidarity, but we also are individuals and want to be creative, entrepreneurs. And he's often said that it's almost like these things have become oppositional, be it public sector, private sector, and community sector, or kind of on the spectrum of ideology and politics. But actually, we need to find ways to sort of hold these things simultaneously because they're symbiotic. And all organizations need to sort of, sort of hold these forces, which essentially help us organize and act. The other thing that came up for me there, Jo, as well, was really sort of saying around how, I suppose, community-centric the design of products and services might be. And it seems to me that the narrative around stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder governance or stakeholder economies is the early start of that. So we're starting to sort of like, well, it would be useful to consider other people around you rather than just your owners, if you want to have a license to operate for the long term. But what would it mean to actually really accelerate that and actually really kind of think around, well, sort of how do we effectively create value, or constantly a process of creating value for stakeholders, be them human or non-human. On that, Kule, I'm just wondering, like, if you working with B Corps across the country, and bearing in mind what Jennifer and Jo have just sort of spoken about, do you see any sort of, pockets of the future, sort of emergent practices which kind of give a sense of like, while some of those futures may seem far away now, but we can actually see the seeds of it in the present?
Yeah, and I think what you just said there around stakeholder governance, which is the core of what B Corp certification is all about. It's about a mindset and a decision-making framework where every decision that's made in a business considers and weighs up all of those various impacts. There's some great examples. I think Chia Sisters, which is one of New Zealand's kind of highest scoring B Corps, talk a lot about how that has really influenced all of their decisions, not just at the kind of exec manager level, but for all the employees, really taking ownership of the impact that all of their decisions have on stakeholders, which is really amazing. And some of the best kind of innovation is coming from those people that work in the business, because they see the real impacts on the day-to-day kind of frontline. When Jennifer was talking about distributed value there, it reminded me of Karma Drinks, who also recently certified, and the way that they really committed to, they started making Karma Cola, which made from the cola nut from Sierra Leone. And I think it's something like less than 1% of the world's cola actually contains cola nut now. But, they've really embedded that community in Sierra Leone into their supply chain, and also, a foundation which, benefits from the sales of their drinks as well. So it's really about involving that community in the design and the distribution of value of that product as well. So yeah, I think that there are some really amazing glimpses, and the most important one is really that mindset shift, because you see it in the founders or the leadership teams that go for B Corp certification, that they're not just trying to tinker around the edges of their current business model, but really trying to redesign the way that it works, so that as Jo says, that purpose is really embedded, and they're not afraid to put that out front and center.
Thanks for that, Kule. So we're going to go into our last round of conversation now, and if in the audience you'd like to start sort of forming up any questions are preferred to comments, although we'd be open to those. But start thinking about those now, and we'll have some time before we wrap to get to you. So we had a little bit of exploration about present state, then we kind of jumped over to like what preferred and possible futures might look like. The next sort of area of inquiry then is just like, what gets us from here to there? What are going to be the areas of disruption? What are going to be the contested areas? What are the areas that we need to innovate into? What will be the transition pathways that enable us to work towards preferred futures, rather than just sort of leaving that to chance or for others to determine? Joe, I'm going to come to you first. For you, what are the sort of the key transition areas that you think we need to be focusing our sort of energy and attention on?
Yes, I guess there's two ways to come at this. One is kind of what are the industries and sectors. So I won't go there, although I will just bring Rod into the conversation. And I think some of the things that he would ask us to focus on are food and agriculture, and the the sort of shift from linear to fully circular. For me personally, I think we need to keep making space for women. That's sort of a foundational starting point, but also for artists and people who tell stories and people who see the world through a different lens than the one that's sort of dominant in the way that we tell stories, be that an Indigenous lens or otherwise. I think that, to pick up on an earlier point, the stories that we tell ourselves about the future are quite crucial, and it seems like the storytellers of the world haven't been mobilized. Like, if you think about the sustainability movement, it sort of starts with business, and our investors and kind of capital providers are activating, and the storytellers are like the last great vanguard of people that we need to really get going. So I think that's super important, because I think if you can't see the future, then it doesn't even really matter if you're figuring out how to get there, because you don't know where you're going. I think that we desperately need to recognize that there's really talented people everywhere. They exist in all parts of the economy, in business, in government, everywhere, and they're passionate and they're committed. And so the way that we would have judged each other before, who was green, who was not, all that stuff's sort of out the window at this point. And then obviously for me, with the finance lens, so borrowing a phrase from Sharon Burrows, there are no jobs on a dead planet. So that's a given, we understand that. But I also can promise that as a long-time sustainability person who didn't speak finance until very recently, there's no meaningful action on transitioning the real economy if the finance sector isn't engaged. So, again, we just sort of have to pull on all the levers that we have. There's other things that I think will disrupt, but then one thing I want to say, because it's a general election year and there's a lot of, kind of stuff happening in the media right now, and a lot of discourse about mitigation or adaptation and what's the role of New Zealand, we're so small and all the rest. Anyone on this call who's in business knows that it's incredibly difficult to do business in an operating environment or a political context that is not sort of stable, where you don't have some level of certainty, where domestic objectives are not aligned with international expectations or international agreements or customer expectations. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that some things will be disruptive and potentially a bit chaotic and not that well organized, and then other things need to stabilize, like right now. And for us in New Zealand, I think that policy certainty and that kind of long run vision for the future and sector level transition plans is a key part of how businesses will decide what to invest in, what to do, and how kids making businesses will figure out like what's their part as an entrepreneur in the whole kind of bigger picture. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
That's wonderful, Joe. I mean, I was taking notes on your first comments, and my sense is anyone that's worked in development economics for a while would say, yeah, there are no silver bullets, but if there was one, it was education of girls and women, and sort of empowering their self-determination. The comment about arts and culture is kind of interesting. I had the chance to spend some time with the people that are platforming the Regen Melbourne initiative, around sort of city transformation plan. And for their early convening, they used the donut economics, to think about how do we apply this to the, Melbourne context. And one of the things that came out from that was there's no space for arts and culture in it. So it seems that a lot of our kind of, transition or transformation language sometimes misses out the importance of art and culture, and that being an incredibly important part of what it means to be human and to, communicate with each other and set norms and form pictures around what we want. So I really appreciate that. The last comment which really resonated with me was this idea of mass mobilization, and how privileged innovation has been for a while. Mariana Mazzucato with, innovation has to be a collective endeavor, not the sort of province of a small group of white men from Silicon Valley. So it seems to me like, how do we enable more people to participate and act? So distributing power as well as value and resources is a critical part of kind of what we want to see. Jennifer, I was going to call you Jen, and I realised I don't know if you like to be called Jen or not, so I'm going to keep with Jennifer for now. Over to you. What do you think the sort of key challenge areas, that the key areas of disruption and transition that we need to focus on?
Well, I sort of think at a macroeconomic scale, but I'm also got some examples at ground level to sort of bring into this answer as well. So I think we need a kind of a three-pronged strategy for disruption and amplification of things. So I think we need to impede the old economic ideas that don't work for us anymore. I think we need to impede them in some way. I think we need to ideate, if you like, the new economy. And I think we need to enable transition. So, so putting up barriers to the old economy would be things like forcing business practices to actually transform. So banning advertising of certain things, banning product obsolescence, and enforcing polluter pays with fines that make it really undesirable for companies to do pollution. So I think those kinds of barriers would be really, really useful. I think amplifying new business models, new economy business models is going to be absolutely crucial to making this shift. And new economy business models will really pick up on those value shifts that I was talking about. And they'll also really pick up on that idea of entities being processes as part of provisioning systems. So there's a number of, there's an emerging taxonomy of new economy business models that's happening right now. And researchers are just beginning to understand what new economy businesses are trying to do. And so some of the sort of definitions, if you like, of this within this new taxonomy include things like sufficiency prosumers, which means that people moving up the sort of supply chain into be more a crucial part of the supply to themselves, and doing so in ways that make that supply more sufficient. So that's things like Kai Cycle in Wellington, which is a community-supported agriculture that you pay upfront for a season's box of vegetables, and so you're splitting the risk there with the farmer who's supplying you. So if they have, some horrible weather pattern, then they don't lose as much as they would have. And then also things like EcoStore, which is doing refills in certain, supermarkets right now. So that's a prosumer idea as well. And then another business model in the taxonomy is people joining forces to provision each other. So things like, I was in your part of the world not too long ago, Alex, and I was in Takaka, and they were doing this co-housing neighborhood, which I thought was a great idea. I'm learning a lot about that in the sort of degrowth masters that I'm doing, housing for degrowth. So co-housing neighborhoods are a really important new business model. And a company that I love in New Zealand is Ngāi Energy, which is a kaupapa Maori power company. And what you do is you buy power from them, and you pay more than you perhaps would have to because you want to, and then the extra goes into communities and into whānau that haven't got as much and need to have that support in getting their energy delivered to them. So I love that business as well. Another business model that's emerging is this idea of equalizing inequalities, which is things like NISA in Wellington, which employs refugee women to make women's underwear and nightwear and things like that. And then finally, shrinking and slowing resource use and resource cycles. So we have more than 40 repair cafes around New Zealand right now, which is fantastic. And we have organizations like Perfectly Imperfect, which picks up fruit and vegetables from crops that don't fit this sort of perfect idea of what should be sold in a supermarket, perfectly healthy and good food. And you can buy it in the store, the Perfectly Imperfect store, or you can get a box delivered to you, which is a really reasonable price. So these are all new economy business models. And, you know, when we can figure out how to scale these up in some way, so we can fit them not just from that small enterprise level, but up to that medium-sized enterprise level, and we can right-size them for communities, I think we're going to be winning on that front. And then going back to the 3 prongs, so the last prong is really helping with business transition, and that's really over to our consulting environment to really develop new knowledge, new consulting methodologies, new standards for businesses, and really helping businesses understand how to do that transition, those transition steps in ways that are kind of familiar to them already, but just bringing in the new ways, the new points of destination, new types of financing, new progressive ideas about financing. And one thing I would say is I think we need to expect unexpected pioneers in this space, because when you think back to the beginning of the sort of sustainability revolution, nobody would have expected a company like Interface, which makes carpet squares for offices, to be one of the more sustainable companies that is now embedding carbon negative emissions into its products. And nobody would have expected the Danish state oil and gas company to become Ørsted, which is now one of the global leaders in offshore wind production and is practically 100% renewable energy. So these unexpected pioneers, I think, are going to take us all pleasantly by surprise. So it's going to be exciting to see who they are going to be.
Fantastic, Jennifer, thank you. So before we open it up to questions, and so please, either be prepared to put your hand up or put something in chat. And just as a heads up, after we've been to Kule, if we don't have any questions, Joe and Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to either ask each other a question or ask the audience one, so be on standby for that. Kule, where I wanted to end with this was that the thinking around sort of B Lab and B Corp was, yes, kind of improving the performance of individual businesses, but also building a movement for change. And again, just kind of sort of movements, it's easy to get into the rhetoric of that. Can you give some examples of where you're actually starting to see self-organization within the B Corp network to engage in transitions which are bigger than themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to note that the B Corp movement is a movement beyond just certifying businesses. And there are lots of ways where there are initiatives being led by B Corps themselves. Jennifer mentioned the refill revolution, or I think maybe it was in the chat, which is being led by Cheer Sisters and some other businesses in that area. There's also the B Corp Beauty collective or coalition, which includes The Body Shop and some other major beauty brands that are cooperating and collaborating on some major challenges that they all face, like packaging or distribution. So it's, I think B Lab as an organization, we are a facilitator and we bring these businesses together, but some of the most innovative collective action pieces are really coming and being led by B Corps themselves. There was also a couple of years ago in Australia, the Not Business as Usual campaign, which was led by Future Super and Intrepid Travel, and they took a full page ad out in the newspaper to encourage businesses to let them let their employees take the day off to participate in the climate strikes. And that got a huge amount of support, and a lot of businesses, not just B Corps, came on board to support that. So it's definitely happening more and more, and I think it's something that as a movement we're trying to encourage and facilitate, giving people the tools to do that and the frameworks for, how do you organize a collective action group? How do you choose what topics to work together on? And that's something that we're looking to facilitate and support more and more. And it's in the B Corp Month name. We go beyond, it's not just us as a business, it's how far we can go together.
It's fantastic. So we do have a couple of questions, and I should say some very good questions might be asked, but we may not be able to give decent answers, because it's such a broad ranging space. So I'm going to frame this up, Jennifer and Joe, and if you feel that you can have a good swing at it, let me know. Otherwise, if you can't, we'll respectfully kind of put it down and move on to the next one, okay? From Hello Circularity, on the topic of the impending current economic ideas that don't serve us, what do our panel think of the concept of a raw materials tax as a wide-reaching approach to curbing extraction? Any thoughts on that? Good on you, Joe. Honestly declining. I think it's good that we don't sort of just pad stuff out. Jennifer, do you have anything, sort of which comes up for you with that question?
I do. From a macroeconomic level, I think any proposal for tax needs to be very carefully modelled and experimented as in tested in the environment before it becomes policy. So I do think there's a lot of merit in a raw materials tax, and I it's a great idea, and I think we should be taxing more things like carbon intensive assets and raw materials extraction than taxing workers' incomes, for instance. So I think there's a lot of merit in it, but I do think that any of these proposals, there really has to be quite a lot of research and discussion that goes on before we can really be confident that they're going to have the right effects and impacts in the economy.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important general comment, that moving into novel spaces, we don't have a precedent for how things are going to work. Well, we may have precedents, but we don't know how things are going to work. And so the world of change is kind of full of unintended consequences. And, as we sort of, develop sort of new ideas, sort of structures or approaches, bringing that learning mindset and treating things as experiments seems to be a really important sort of, way to sort of engage in transition. So Louise, thanks for your question here around sort of innovation and the innovation is living with privilege legacy. I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but the way that I'm going to interpret this is like, how do we democratize innovation? So like right at the beginning, Jennifer, you were sort of talking about sort of the enablement of communities, but it could go more to citizens more generally, sort of small and medium size enterprises. Like if innovation relative to the pressures that we're starting to face is really important, how do we actually create the platforms to enable more people to organize and act? Joe, Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that?
Tell me the question again.
How do we democratize innovation? How do we enable more people to sort of, I hesitate to say be entrepreneurs, but, how do we enable more people to have agency, sort of around in creating change in their lives and, through their businesses and their communities?
Yeah, I guess it depends on who we are. I think there's a role for government in this, and some of the types of things that we hear are things like supporting demonstration projects or figuring out ways to invest alongside the private sector and new models or projects or ways of doing things. So I think that that's a role for government. But I guess if we as the B Corp community or the business community, I think to some degree it does come down to the businesses being willing to innovate themselves, and some of the contextual things I referenced earlier, such as the policy certainty, kind of shared vision of where we're going in the long run, you know, direction of travel. As far as democratization of that, I mean, that comes back to the earlier comment about it's really hard to, you know, yeah, depending on what assets and things that you've got available to you and coming into entrepreneurship, it's quite hard to be an entrepreneur sometimes. So maybe we have to figure out how we, you know, think about credit risk, generally what we use as security to help people with business loans and those types of things. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too specific, but that's some of the ideas that I think are floating around.
No, good, and specifics good, I think. So thanks for that, Jo. Jennifer, did you want to have a sort of response to that at all?
Yeah, well, I think Mariana Mazzucato has got some great ideas about democratizing innovation through mission economy. And I think when you start thinking about provisioning systems, then innovation has to be something that actually adds to the provisioning system. And once you realize that your entity is a process within the provisioning system, then whatever innovation comes in there belongs to the whole system. And so you have a completely different attitude about what innovation, where it comes from, what it's for, and who delivers it, and what your role is in creating or delivering innovation. And, you know, entrepreneurs are a really important part of that process. And I guess we're going to come to some questions, hopefully, about how we fund entrepreneurs, and we you know, initiate new ways of funding entrepreneurs in a new economy that perhaps isn't as driven as much around profit and returns. So, you know, that's probably maybe not for this webinar, but for a future webinar, we need to talk about those kind of post-growth financing ideas. And that's all about how we get innovation out of, you know, research centers and into people's hands as actual products.
Yeah.
So yeah, and there are business models that help as well with that, like the you know, the sort of open decentralized sort of thing, you know, software hackathons and things like that. And there's the New Zealand Open Source Society, which is really focused on this kind of material being shared in society as well.
I'm certainly a believer in thinking of innovation infrastructure as infrastructure. So in the same way, you know, we recognize we can't drive cars, although that might be a bit tone deaf for this conversation, but, you know, without roads, and that we need, you know, kind of water, waste, electrical, energy, you know, systems infrastructure. If we want more people to organize and act, we have to recognize that the conditions need to be enabling for that. And, you know, so, you know, sort of treat innovation infrastructure as infrastructure. Okay, so moving on to the next question. It's a long one from Aaron. Jo and Jennifer, can you read it in the chat? Because I think I'll probably just stumble over it if I try and read it out loud. But I'll while you're having a look at it, I'll see if I can sort of get the core essence of this. We've talked about this. Right, so how do we kind of, I suppose, how do we respond to the disruption created by natural disasters, you know, to use the process of recovery and rebuilding as transition points? That's kind of my reading of that. And, you know, and appreciate that this is a really sort of sensitive issue at this time for many people in Aotearoa. So, like, any thoughts on that at all?
I think the stories that come out of how people have coped and recovered from these things will form part of our knowledge bank about how we build resilience into our new economy. So I think it was, Jo, you were saying earlier about how you thought storytelling was really important and had been undermined perhaps by, you know, I can see it in media disinformation and things like that. Storytelling has been diminished. But really that's something that will help us understand how, you know, recovery from where we've just been can help us see how to get to the future that we want to reach.
I guess my intuitive answer to this is to center community, right? And whatever the community is that's been affected, center them in the solution and in the design of the solution. And I think really importantly, when it comes to specifically, the impacts of the cyclone and where to put the houses and how to manage retreat, I think that having data so that community can be participant in that decision-making process is really, really important. And so we're at the beginning of that journey, right, of understanding where all the risks really are and how we kind of make sure that people have access to that information. But I do think that in order for people to participate meaningfully in a rebuild or a recovery, or in thinking about long-term resilience of their own community, then they really need to be able to access that data.
So for me, I mean, that comes back to governance in many respects, and I think ask some sort of interesting questions around beyond stakeholder governance. What does actually kind of more distributed governance actually look like? How would that work? How does that change our concepts as the way we think governance does work, which is, quite informed by, corporate governance of organizations which produce things and create value. But when we can't use hierarchy, and we've got to consider a sort of a range of more complex things than how an organization navigates its own sort of progress. I think that sort of asks some really interesting design questions of governance, and like, how do more people have access to good information and have voice in these decisions, which are incredibly important from them now, but also building the blocks for the future that we're moving into. There are some other things coming in, but I'm going to leave it here. We're coming up to the hour, and it's important that we do finish on time. So from me, Jennifer and Joe, thank you so much. Really enjoyed that conversation. Who needs Rod Oram? And Kule, I'm going to hand back over to you to close out.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex, Joe, and Jennifer. What an amazing conversation. I think the quality of the questions and comments in the chat is really reflective of just all the amazing ideas you've been able to share with us today. A shame we couldn't have Rod here. I'm hoping it's because he's out having a lovely dinner somewhere in Europe and is just enjoying his time far too much. And hopefully we'll get him onto a future session to chat. But yeah, some amazing ideas. And I know it's sometimes tricky to take all of this kind of information and then go back to our day jobs and hold that space between what we're doing now versus where we want to be in 50 or 100 years time. So thank you all for being here and taking some of this on with you into your day. I'm going to just close us out with a closing karakia, which again is about going back into our day with this wisdom that we've acquired and holding that space between sort of now and the future. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nāko, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takata. Koia rā e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga, kia tina, kuie, kai kie.
Kai kie.